Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of Great Decisions 2021 with Manitowoc Public Library. And before I turn things over to Professor Wheat, just a couple of announcements as usual. Of course, right off the top, I wanted to thank the sponsors for Great Decisions, because without them, we wouldn't be here even virtually presenting this. So our thanks go out to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So once again, thank you to our sponsors. I also wanted to call to your attention that there are very few copies left of the Great Decision Companion publication for this year. They're available at the library for $15 in cash or check. You can come into the library since we're open again. You can come in and get it for yourself, or you can call 920-686-3010 and ask for a copy to be brought out to your car, and they will do that. You can arrange for curbside pickup of the publication, and either way, it's they would prefer it if you had exact change, so $15. But very few copies left. I hear under 5 copies are left. So also wanted to mention to you that if you have any questions or comments about the lecture that's going on, of course, at the end, we'll have our Q&A session, and just type your comments or questions into the comments box on either Facebook or on YouTube, and I will get them and I will pass them along to Professor Wheat. Don't forget, if you want to know about the upcoming weeks, or if you'd be so inclined to make a donation to the Great Decisions Legacy Fund so that it can be completely self-sustaining. And we love our sponsors, but it would be magnificent if we could, do without them. And so we're trying to build the Great Decisions Legacy Fund. That is not to discount anything our sponsors do. They're incredible, but becoming self-sustaining would be great. So just head to www.manitowoclibrary.org/great-decisions. And you can download the pamphlet that you would usually get, that you receive when you come into the room. It has the donation information there, and also it has what's coming up in the final 2 weeks following this evening, if you'd like a little bit of a preview. Just a few programming things to mention. The children's picture book sale is still going on, 50 cents a book, or a grab bag of 12 for $5. That can also be arranged for curbside pickup, or you can come into the library to do it. Our study rooms are once again open. That happened today. So that is the newest addition to the library, is study rooms are once again available. You have to wear a mask. It's single occupancy, but there are no time limits. So if you need to spend a lot of time in a study room by yourself, you can do it now at the library. And also, the final thing before I get to our speaker this evening's bio is that if you are so inclined, this Wednesday at 7 p.m. on our Facebook page, Cats on Mats Yoga, virtual lifetime yoga. Our yoga instructor, Kay Casey, will be doing the yoga instruction with her cats, and she encourages you to do the same. So if you are so inclined, that is this Wednesday on our Facebook page at 7 p.m. So allow me to introduce our speaker this evening. Elizabeth Wheat is an associate professor in public and environmental affairs and political science at UW Green Bay. She is originally from Marshall, Michigan, and completed her master's degree at Indiana University and her doctorate in political science at Western Michigan University. Elizabeth teaches courses in global environmental politics, environmental law and policy, natural resources, the presidency, international law and policy, and sustainability. In most of her courses, students participate in mock trials, model United Nations simulations, or environmental policy debates. She is also a proud dog mama to 3 pups and 2 cats, who I assume she is also proud of, including a Siamese named Claude Monet, spelled C-L-A-W' Monet. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Elizabeth Wheat and Struggles Over the Melting Arctic. And 1 second while I bring up her PowerPoint presentation. And Professor Wheat,
thank you very
the
much.
screen is yours.
All right. So tonight we'll be talking about some of the issues in the Arctic. And the Great Decisions book takes a bit more of a foreign policy and national security approach. And so we're going to be adding in some of the environmental and political discussions as well. Next. So I wanted to bring in a little bit of my background and also, I think, give a more well-rounded picture of what's really happening in the incredibly special part of the country. So we'll discuss some of the environmental factors, the geographic importance, political implications, some of the national security concerns, and then some of the areas that I think we'll want to consider in the future. Next, please. When we start thinking about this area, I think really looking at what is the Arctic. So there are 8 Arctic states, the US by way of Alaska, Canada, Denmark with Greenland, Norway, Russia, Iceland, Sweden, and Finland. And there's 2 kind of main regional differences that we see. So with the European Arctic, this is Greenland to Russia via Norway, much more densely populated than the North American Arctic. And so the largest Arctic city in Russia is going to be about 300,000. In contrast, North American Arctic is going to be really northern Canada and Alaska. And one of the main governing bodies with these states is called the Arctic Council. This is a consensus-based group that was established in 1996. And this intergovernmental group works to coordinate with the Arctic states, indigenous peoples, and the inhabitants. And so this is really the main governmental forum for this particular region. Iceland chaired it from 2019 to 2021. And so at some point this year, Russia will take over the chair until 2023. There are a few different kinds of participants in addition to the states on the council. We have 6 permanent participants, and these are organizations that are representing Arctic indigenous groups, and they will have full consultation rights just like one of the states would. For the working groups, these are a little bit different, and they tend to focus on different issues. And so we have one on contaminants, there's monitoring and assessment, flora and fauna, emergency preparedness, the marine environment, and sustainable development. And then lastly, we have the observers. And these are participants who largely work with the working groups. And there are 13 non-Arctic countries. So examples include France, we have Italy, China, Singapore, the United Kingdom, and a few others. Then we have intergovernmental and interparliamentary organizations. There are 13 of those. And then there are 12 approved non-governmental organizations. And the Arctic Council, like I said, has been really active in developing agreements among the Arctic 8. And 3 of the more recent ones include an agreement on aeronautical and maritime searches, one on marine oil pollution preparedness, and then the last one on Arctic scientific cooperation. And we'll touch on kind of each of these 3 areas as we go. And then lastly, really wanted to emphasize the importance of the indigenous people in the area. And the gentleman you see on the right is a local fisherman named Muke. And this picture was taken in Byron Bay on Victoria Island. And I will say several of the pictures tonight are from a colleague, Bonnie Hamilton, who is getting her PhD at the University of Toronto and working on microplastics research. So very heartfelt thank you for sharing pictures and helping me with pronunciations on a number of the names and terms tonight. So with indigenous people such as Muke here, we have about 4 million people overall that live in these Arctic states' northern provinces. 10% of those are indigenous, and many are distinct to the Arctic. And so we have about 11 distinct native cultures, many of whom are dependent on the migratory caribou herd and on the Arctic fisheries. Next slide, please. We'll talk about 2 different kinds of the environmental factors, both with the ecosystem and the species. And since we just had International Polar Bear Day a couple days ago, we of course have to start with featuring the polar bear here. Next slide, please. Beginning with the landscape, give you a little bit of a sense of what life is like at different points in the year with the Arctic. From about early April to early September, all daylight. And then there's a very quick transition period to no direct sunlight from October through March. The warmest day in July, which is quite honestly warm to us in Wisconsin right now, is about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's, again, in July. So it's about as toasty as you're going to get. In 2020, though, we observed extremely high temperatures in the spring and in the summer. And that gets to the importance of these polar regions as really critical barometers of global warming. Over the last few decades, really, we've seen statistically significant warming trends in this area. And we know that this is going to have really big effects on the marine food web. So I'll highlight a few of those climate change risk factors. The first is you have declining sea ice. And as the ice is melting, this is leading to rising sea levels and extreme weather events in the Arctic. And so, for example, with Greenland, big ice sheet is part of a larger trend of significant ice loss. We observe this in Alaska and Arctic Canada as well. Second big problem is declining sea ice thickness. This relates to the thickness itself, but also the extent, the volume, and then the seasonality with the ice. Next problem is changes in the air temperature with the sea ice. And there's kind of a complicated relationship that I will defer to my science friends for the details on this one. But essentially, you have the productivity of the Arctic tundra heavily influenced and dependent on the air temperature. So it's very sensitive to any changes there. And so any changes in that air temperature will affect the vegetation. We also have complications with the ocean surface temperatures, and those temperatures are going to be tied to the presence or the absence of ice. Okay, and then the next climate change challenge we have is the seasonality of the snow cover. This will have a lot of pretty big effects on controlling wildfire activity in the northern latitudes, which might not have been an area you think of in a really cold place, but actually as these areas become warmer, there's more availability of fuel and more favorable conditions for fire growth and intense burning. Most of the Arctic fires are in the taiga boreal forest, which is the world's largest terrestrial biome. And then lastly, we have permafrost coastal erosion. Most of the people in the Arctic are going to be living in coastal zones. And it's also the area where we see most of the industrial, commercial, tourist, and military activities. And so these air temperatures, the storminess, the ice, and the ocean conditions are all really big factors in that permafrost erosion. As this erosion is happening, it's also a key source of carbon dioxide and methane being released into the atmosphere, both of which are greenhouse gases. And so you get really this compounding effect of the greenhouse gases getting worse. And if you ever want to check out a really good documentary on sort of this ice situation, it's called Chasing Ice. And just the science and the technology and cameras they created and designed to measure these ice melts and to measure the glaciers, it's incredibly profound. And so I highly recommend taking a look at that one. The second landscape issue I wanted to bring up was that of microplastics. And with microplastics, these will travel on ocean currents and through the air, and they can accumulate in animals. And we actually have observed really high concentrations of these microplastics in the sea ice. So some of the highest on the planet are in the Arctic Ocean surface water. The sea ice is going to transport and store the microplastics, plus being transported through the air. And these plastics can be found in stomachs of polar fish, blue mussels, snow crabs, and now there's the growing concern that it could get into food that's consumed by humans. And this is a critical challenge for the Arctic because you have a heavy reliance on marine ecosystems for food and culture. Next slide. And this one will kind of walk you through how the pollution contaminates the Arctic. And so I gotta lean a little bit here to myself. So you have these products that are going to be breaking down into really small particles. Those then, you can see on the left here, will reach the surface and kind of get transported through the air a little bit and to get the microplastic fragments. From there, you have winds and the currents that are carrying the microplastics into the atmosphere, then deposited for thousands of miles. So these are traveling in great distances. And then lastly, you have the clouds and sort of falling snow trapping them. And so at that point, the microplastics are going to get stuck in the ice and on the surface, and then really having a bigger effect on the water quality and on the species as well there. Okay, next slide, please. This one is it's a little bit different. And so this will show over the last 10 years, scientists have documented different concentrations of plastic litter, including microplastics, all over the Arctic. And it's important to remember this is traveling to the Arctic. It's not really originating there that much. And so you can see the different colors. Yellow is going to be, believe the surface water. So the key is really small on the slides for me. So you can see on the surface with the Arctic, that's where most of the concentrations are, right? It's where most of the yellow dots are. But we're also seeing this quite a bit more on the beaches and discovering this on the open sea. So as we're thinking about ways to address the microplastics going forward, this can have a pretty significant effect. Next slide, please. As we look at the species themselves, there's a lot to choose from. And so I just kind of picked a few that I think are interesting for us to chat about tonight. Overall, with the sensitivity of this ecosystem, it's a really special, really unique area and incredibly rich for scientific work. It's home to about 21,000 or so known species of cold-adapted plants, animals, and microbes. And the sea ice itself is a really key habitat in a lot of different ways. So for example, excuse me, with walruses leaving calves, while they'll dive for food, they'll leave the calves on the ice. So it's critical for resting. For polar bears, the sea ice is important for travel, hunting, and mating. The sea ice can also provide protection from different predators. And then in terms of the melting, as the sea ice is melting, this can affect the range of a number of different species. So for example, with the Arctic fox, the effects on the range can shift the tree lines, which will shift their habitat. It may also change the migration route for species such as orcas, actually giving them a wider range and making them a predator to more Arctic species. And then with the migration routes for caribou, not only can it change the literal route that they're going, but it might change the conditions of that route. So we start to see caribou drowning in rivers that had been previously frozen. We might also start to see plants covered with ice instead of snow. And so they're also causing a food shortage. And so there are a lot of different unique species that are going to be impacted in this area. Just a couple of that I kind of chose to talk about. We have the Sima ringed seal. This is in Lake Sima, Finland. There are about 350. It's their only home. And in recent years, they've observed that the snow is not deep enough on the lake to build their birthing dens. This is a really big threat to the survival of that species. And additionally, with polar bears, as there's less sea ice, they're having to travel much further for food. And they're spending more time on land, and we're starting to see their survival decline. World Wildlife Fund projects that we have the potential to lose 30% of the world's polar bear population by 2050. And then looking at some of the at-risk species, in addition to the ones that we've mentioned, we have the narwhals, which you see pictured on the top left. The narwhals need thick ice protection from the orcas. Okay, so really it's kind of a barrier for them. They're also at risk for the effects from different industrial activities and shipping. So the noise, it can interfere with their communication. It can also scare away fish that they would need to survive on. As I mentioned with the walruses, if they don't have the sea ice, then they're forced on land or on shore, which can lead to more conflict with people, aircraft disruption, and sort of sitting ducks for more of the polar bear predators as well. And then lastly, with the fisheries, this is nicknamed the blue economy. Large portions of the Arctic communities work in fishing and are dependent on it. And so in Greenland alone, fisheries are over 90% of the exports and a key source of jobs and food for that population. Annual catch in the Arctic, to give you a sense of scale here, is 2.5 million tons. 99% of that total catch is going to be from commercial and artisanal fishers, 1% from subsistence. For the fish themselves, the Arctic fish have largely adapted to the sea. Most of them have a pretty narrow temperature range, which puts them at the greatest risk for climate change. So essentially, as the sea ice is retreating, the fishing is moving further north, and as the species are moving north for those colder waters. So this is going to change the range of the fish and the availability of new fishing grounds. These new fishing grounds are not covered or protected by existing regional management organizations. We don't have laws, we don't have groups that deal with it because it hasn't existed, right? And so as these are changing, it's going to pose a huge risk or challenge for how we manage these fisheries. Another challenge that comes along with that are increased fossil fuels and CO2 concentrations. And as you have more shipping, as you have more activity, this concentration will increase the acidity of the ocean. This will have a lot of effects on marine organisms, but particularly on shell-forming invertebrates. Okay, so it's going to be a particular risk for them. There's been discussion of doing fishing and commercial development in what's called the EEZ, or the Exclusive Economic Zone of the United States, but we don't really have regulation of commercial fisheries in the Arctic. And so essentially a global commons that we just haven't addressed yet. And so this can have really a big potential harmful effect on the species and the ecosystems, and then the communities that are dependent on them. In 2018, there was a moratorium on fishing in the Arctic Ocean, in the central Arctic Ocean, and we may need more of these kinds of agreements or moratoriums in the future. Now, the U.S. Northern Pacific Fisheries Management Council has a philosophy that they operate on called ecosystem-based management. And under EBM, you're balancing different competing uses. And that's really what we're going to need to be thinking of as we're looking at this Arctic system going forward. The European Union has a similar philosophy, and they have also called for more institutional changes. So they really want to see new fishery management and an international Arctic body. Next slide, please. These are just a few of the research stations, and these research stations are really important for understanding the impacts of climate change, researching the Arctic, and helping with search and rescue operations. Multiple governments have permanent research stations known as Arctic bases or polar stations or ice stations. And for these ice stations, they're constructed on land or on ice that rests on land. And then some will actually drift at sea, drift on the sea ice. So a lot of really exciting opportunities, lots of very cold weather gear that, kind of make our Wisconsin weathers look pretty tropical. A number of these stations will collaborate with Indigenous people in the community who have subsisted on this land for generations. And it's really cool to hear about how they're working together, observing the sea ice thickness, monitoring the populations, but really just sharing science, sharing culture, and developing that community to help improve the environment and to improve that ecosystem. Two examples of particularly good monitoring and assessment actors are the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program and the Protection of the Marine Environment. Both of their websites have really cool reports and a lot that you can check out if you would like to learn more. One station I wanted to highlight briefly is the Alert Station. This is under command of the Royal Canadian Air Force. It is the most northerly and permanently inhabited location in the world, about 817 kilometers from the North Pole. This will signal intelligence facilities for the Canadian military operations. They have about 55 full-time military and civilian personnel at that station. So there's a lot of really cool stations up there. I just again picked a few countries to feature for tonight. Next, please. Looking at the geographic importance, you can see from the environmental aspects, the really special, unique system, a lot of natural resources, and then the research opportunities. As these global fish stocks and fisheries shift, it's going to be even more important to understand the geography of what is happening in the Arctic itself. With oil and natural gas, estimates are that 13% of undiscovered oil and 30% of undiscovered gas can be found in the Arctic. This is going to be particularly important for countries such as Russia, which we'll talk about in a bit. With regards to trade and shipping, as the melting of the sea ice will continue, new navigable shipping routes will open. And one of the important aspects with these shipping routes are icebreakers. So when it's about 4 feet or so, these icebreakers will go ahead of the freighter and really break the ice so the cargo ship or freighter can travel through. A really good documentary on the Arctic shipping and shipping around the world is called Freightin', like shipping freight. And it gets into some of the environmental aspects, but I think it really helps you understand how these shipping routes will change in the future and what the implications of that mean, both from a consumer standpoint, but also from an environmental standpoint. And then lastly, we have military and national security. And I'll get into this a little bit more as we start talking about the separate countries. But for a lot of the Arctic states, the Arctic is a critical location for national security and for monitoring efforts. Next slide, please. This will show you the sea ice changes from 1985 to 2018. And so you can see, in 1985, much older, essentially thicker and deeper ice, and then dramatic changes over the decades to 2018. Next. And this one will walk through, again, kind of a negative title with this, but I'm a little bit more optimistic and don't want to believe it's entirely inevitable. But this will show the trends developed by UCLA climate scientists on sea ice melting over time. And it is melting faster than we had projected. And now estimates are saying that the Arctic Ocean may be ice-free for part of the year between 2044 and 2067. We're losing just about 13% of the ice per decade on this. So alarming rates that we need to really start thinking about and try and working to slow down a little bit. Next slide. Now, I wouldn't be a good political scientist if I didn't walk you through some of the political agreements and kind of some of the security issues here. So the first big one we have to talk about is the Law of the Sea. Now, both the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the Arctic Council agreements have been important for helping maintain a stable political environment in this area. Law of the Sea will govern offshore resources. And so for coastal states, you have the right to explore and extract marine resources within your EEZ, which is that exclusive economic zone. That EEZ goes 200 nautical miles off the coast. Okay. Beyond those 200 miles, so beyond that EEZ, a territory is considered open to consultation. So if a state can prove that their seafloor is an extension of their own continental shelf, they may have rights beyond that EEZ. The United States has signed but not ratified that convention. So we follow parts of it, but we cannot file any claims under that convention. The additional convention that's important to help with the Law of the Sea is the UN Convention on the limits of the continental shelf. And so under this one, Arctic states can submit claims to get a larger share of that shelf. Okay. And the commission will work on establishing claims of that shelf. And those can be really critical to fishing rights or commercial activities. And so there's a lot at stake for the countries with these claims. In 2013, President Obama developed the Arctic Strategy, and this had 3 main areas of focus: advancing U.S. security interests, pursuing responsible Arctic region stewardship, strengthening international cooperation. And it heavily emphasized coordinating with the Alaskan natives. In 2015, Obama will visit the Arctic during the period of time when the United States was chairing the Council, and the Arctic Council will adopt a scientific cooperative agreement with the U.S. as chair. This agreement will recognize climate change and emphasize the effect of the changing sea ice on the area, especially on Indigenous communities. The Arctic Council's role will evolve a bit. Finland is going to take over as chair in 2017. And with the previous administration, U.S. interest in the council starts to decline a bit. In 2019, Secretary of State Pompeo said the Arctic was an area for power and competition, especially with Russia and China. This is a big change in the approach than kind of the previous diplomatic or Arctic strategy. Pompeo will call for much stronger U.S. engagement in the Arctic, which gets us to 2019 with U.S. discussion on purchasing Greenland. Now, the Arctic in general is a good location for missile defense capabilities, a lot of surveillance infrastructure, and some strategic forces. There's the potential for U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, but there hasn't been a lot of investment yet. So in 2019, Trump administration discussed wanting to buy Greenland, later walked it back, claiming that was a joke. But about a year later, the State Department puts forth a guidance document safeguarding the Arctic, along with equipping it with the new fleet of icebreakers. And the State Department also created a Arctic coordinator. So at the end of the day, we don't buy Greenland, but we do give $12 million in aid for economic development that focused on developing energy, natural resources, expanding education, and increasing tourism. And so a lot of political considerations going on with this area as well. As I mentioned, this Arctic is important during the Cold War with the superpower standoff, and there's continued to be this tension with the U.S. and former Soviet Union, now particularly dealing with Russia, which is where we will start. So Russia has thousands of miles of territory and coastline, about 24,000 miles of coastline above the Arctic Circle. They're going to have two main economic interests. The first, they're well positioned to exploit oil and natural gas opportunities. About 70% of Russia's reserves are on the continental shelf, most in the Arctic. They're also positioned well geographically and logistically with development of those shipping routes as the sea ice declines and these new routes. This will have could have a big impact on Siberia, where a lot of those routes would travel through. Now, Russia wants to become a maritime trading power and reestablish the military power. They have a fleet. Northern Fleet is based on the Kola Peninsula. They also have strategic submarines that are critical to their status as a nuclear power. And they've been relatively unobstructed with establishing and expanding this power. They have a monopoly on guided icebreaker escorts through the Northern Sea Route and actually have the world's largest icebreaker fleet. But they've also helped with this international research expedition called Mosaic. It includes about 20 different countries, such as the United States and China. Shifting gears to China a bit, China, not considered an Arctic state. They've largely been excluded from politics in the region, but they want to be more involved. And so really a less obvious player, their closest territory is about 5,000 miles by sea from the Bering Strait. In 2013, China will get observer status on the Arctic Council. They have a new icebreaker that's also working with that same Mosaic research project. And in 2018, China commissioned a nuclear icebreaker. Currently, Russia is the only other country to operate a nuclear icebreaker, so China wants to get into that realm as well. And the last big China effort is called the Polar Silk Road. It's a 2018 collaboration with a number of other countries to develop Arctic shipping routes. It's part of their larger Belt Road Initiative. This could be a cooperative effort with Russia, but it really is intended to further their long-term interests in minerals and expanding Chinese access to Arctic energy resources. With Canada, very different approach here with Canada. They do control the Northwest Passage, considering it internal territory largely, and a lot of cooperative efforts with the United States. They do have a research icebreaker called the Amundsen with state-of-the-art research capabilities and a number of incredible labs that are on the ship itself. And Canada does quite a few joint efforts with this kind of scientific cooperation, information sharing, and also joint military exercises. So they've worked with the U.S. to create sustainable shipping lanes through the Arctic waters, and they're committed to decreasing the use of highly polluting heavy fuel oils in the Arctic waters. Both of these joint efforts can be really important models going forward as we have to think about other environmental effects. And then the last big cooperative effort between Canada and the US is NORAD, which is the North American Aerospace Defense Command. This is a combined organization to provide monitoring and detection of North American airspace, and it also will warn of attacks. And for those with young children, NORAD is also the organization that is tracking Santa for you. So really diverse kind of efforts that they're part of. When we get to the last three countries here, looking at Denmark and friends, Denmark, Iceland, and Norway have quite a bit in common. They're all in NATO. They're all receiving economic interest from China, and they're all feeling a lot of pressure from Russia with Russia's military buildup. So we'll start with Greenland. It's an autonomous region of Denmark.
We would appear to...
Yep. Oh, there we go.
There we go. Welcome
Apologies
back.
for the Wi-Fi here. Live from home in 2021 teaching us. Thank you for your patience. So when we start with, we'll go back to Greenland here. This is an autonomous region of Denmark, and they do have control over their own domestic issues. And then the Danish government is sovereign over foreign affairs and defense. So there's been growing Chinese investment in mining, airport construction, and real estate. From the international community, there's concern that over this Chinese infrastructure involvement and whether that could be used to block NATO efforts in the future. Russia will use the airspace over the country en route to the North Atlantic. They've also upgraded their airspace in the Russian Arctic. From the United States standpoint, quite a bit of increase in U.S. diplomacy, as mentioned with the attempted purchase of Greenland. But there's also been a lot of pressure on Denmark to increase their own military and push back on that Chinese influence. The U.S. really wants Greenland to support its political and military objectives. And we've actually reopened a U.S. consulate in Greenland and given the aid that I mentioned earlier. With Iceland, Iceland has no standing military of its own. They rely on U.S. and NATO for defense. Extended diplomatic and economic ties with China. They've signed a number of big agreements in recent years, one on geothermal energy in 2012, free trade in 2013, and scientific research in 2018. The Chinese investment is now 6% of Iceland's GDP and 11% of Greenland's GDP, actually. In 2006, U.S. military troops left the country, and so Iceland then developed their own national security policy and council. In 2019, the U.S. Pentagon gave money to expand and upgrade the runways and the facilities at this airfield. And in 2019, on a state visit with Secretary Pompeo and Vice President Pence claimed that Iceland had declined to participate in China's Belt Road Initiative when actually Iceland had not decided yet. So we had a bit of a diplomatic fuss with that premature announcement. And then lastly, again, we mentioned Russia has a history of supporting Iceland with money during an economic crisis and with trade. So Iceland's really in the middle of all kind of the big three conflict with Russia, China, and the United States. And then Norway, I think, is a fascinating study to look at. So there's an archipelago called Svalbard. It's halfway between the North Pole and Norway. Has a really unique and important legal status. There's a Svalbard Treaty, and it gives Norway sovereignty over this island. But here's the catch. It also will give limited rights to signatories to this treaty. If you're a signatory, then you must be allowed equal access to the economic activities. So your mining, maritime, commercial, all of it. As you would imagine, heavily contested legal status of the maritime and fishery zones around this area. Russia will also have a settlement that is established around a functioning coal mine on the archipelago. And 1/5 of the archipelago's population actually lives in this settlement. So a lot of complaints from Russia and China about the local business regulations and these kinds of restrictions on their environmental activities. To help with the environmental efforts, Norway established a fisheries protective zone instead of an exclusive economic zone. And this will help, again, protect their fisheries and protect that resource for the country. Russia will contest Norway's authority over this zone. And there have been other disputes with Norway and Russia. Norway strongly advocates for a strong NATO presence in the Arctic, which Russia is not supportive. So Norway's had a bit of conflict with regards to who they're working with and what those relationships look like. Next slide, please. This shows you some of the different territorial claims. And you can see here you have the 200 nautical miles line is going to be kind of the red line. And that will show you how far out from the country's border. You can see Russia, quite a few territorial claims. US, not so much, a little bit off of Alaska, but not much beyond our zone. And then quite a few with Norway there as well. And it also gives you the passage routes there too. Next slide, please. As we see the sea ice melt, we have to be thinking about what the shipping changes look like, and to accompany that, what the oil spill risks are. And as these more shipping routes are opening and the volume of shipping increases, we can expect there to be more oil spills. The US Coast Guard and NOAA are working on joint scientific research expeditions and oil spill drills. There's also a really cool GIS mapping project that does simulated spills, so they can kind of imagine where the oil might go. It's called the Arctic Environmental Response Management Application, or IRMA. And then we have kind of 4 big challenges with these oil spills. The first is that this is an incredibly sensitive Arctic ecosystem. Decades after we saw, the oil spill in Valdez, Alaska, there's still environmental harm from that. And so we know if there's a spill in the Arctic, it's going to really damage the system. The second challenge is this is a remote location. And so there can be a really long distance to travel for any kind of first responder. Third challenge, there's not enough ships right now with the appropriate cleanup equipment. So as shipping would increase, you need to be thinking about what kind of response equipment will be available. And then lastly, the weather conditions in this area change fast and can be very extreme. And so really thinking about how to manage that, how to respond to that, and the training that will be required. Next slide, please. This will show you the 2 Arctic shipping routes. And so you can see you've got the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route, along with a few others. And similar to one of the charts earlier, it really has changed quite a bit from where we were in 1985 to kind of the sea ice as of 2017. Next slide, please. This one I think is fascinating. And so, and you look at the chart on the left, this is to the period of time 2015 to 2030. And as the global warming continues, but routes by 2030 could be open for more ice-breaking cargo ships. And the route time would also be shortened as they can kind of shave off a little bit of time on each of those routes. When you get to 2045 to 2060, now, if the sea ice trends continue, even ordinary cargo ships can go directly over the North Pole. And so you might have incredibly short journey times compared to where we're at now when you have to have that icebreaker escort to get around. Next slide, please. This is a website I highly recommend you go and check out. The World Wildlife Fund will do kind of this simulation where you can see, worst case of a discharge. In this scenario, they had a 120-day spill, millions of barrels that were spilled in that. And so you watch the spill take place, and then you can look at different oil concentrations on the surface, both low and high concentrations, the shoreline impact, the probability of the surface contamination. And then when you see that added selected layers, if there's a given species you want to focus on, you can see what the effect would be on that species. And so I think it's one way to look at how a spill can affect a really wide range of systems and aspects of that ecosystem. Next slide, please. So what do we need to think of next? There's, I think, quite a few future considerations here. With climate change, as I mentioned, these new shipping routes are going to have a big impact. This may also open new cruise tourism opportunities. And all of these are incredibly wasteful and dumping a lot of waste into these sensitive areas and needing to think about what we want to protect and how we want to regulate those. Additionally, we have the fisheries moving and we have the sea ice complications. And so a lot of moving pieces with climate change. Under the current administration, the US has recommitted to the Paris Agreement. And if the US and other countries are able to get on target, that will help. But even the Paris Agreement wasn't as aggressive as we really need to protect the Arctic. We have to do more than what's required in that one. We also need to be thinking about what is happening to the indigenous communities. As I mentioned earlier, the ecosystem-based management philosophy is important to the US Council that works in our Arctic, to the European Union with their countries working in the Arctic. And then the Arctic Council itself has taken an ecosystem approach to managing activities. So they'll look at the geographic extent, biological and physical aspects, ecological objectives on sustainability, the current state of the ecosystem, so your basic data baseline, how we assess the current ecosystem, how we value both the cultural, social, and economic goods, and then how do we manage our own human activities to sustain this ecosystem. We have to think of this much more holistically and thinking about what this is going to do with the indigenous communities. And this could be really interesting to keep an eye on in the next few years. Pending confirmation, Deb Haaland would be the first Native American appointed to a cabinet level position. And so very unique perspective that she would bring to the cabinet. And so we can anticipate potentially more discussion of indigenous communities and really more inclusion in the environmental decisions that get made. And then with shipping, we mentioned the risk of the oil spills and thinking of habitat destruction. These areas are showing effects of climate change, but shipping would take these harms to a completely new level and really thinking about how we can protect the amazing biodiversity of this space is going to be important. Going along with that, what the research opportunities are. A lot of really cool initiatives and research stations and needing more of that, needing to invest in these communities and just improving our science and our knowledge on the space. And then lastly, thinking about the military security. This is an important area for security for a lot of different countries. And so how do we continue to improve that and address that? Okay, last slide. I wanted to feature this young woman who, the more you read about her, is incredibly impressive. She's an 18-year-old British woman named Maya Rose Craig, and she's a climate change advocate and claims she's a very talented ornithologist. She went on a Greenpeace Arctic expedition to investigate marine life in this region. It's the most northerly youth strike ever. And I think as an educator, I'm always really inspired by students who don't just talk about what they believe, but they really put it into action like that. And so I want to wrap up with a quote from her. She says, "I'm here because I want to see for myself what's at stake as this crucial protector of the planet, the Arctic Ocean, melts away at a terrifying rate. Today, myself and Fridays for Future activists from all over the world are standing up to call for urgent action against climate breakdown." And so to me, I think she's incredibly inspirational, and I hope we have lots more people who are that committed to learning about this area and passionate about protecting it. And I look forward to hearing your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Wheat, for that incredible presentation. As you've seen scrolling on the bottom of the screen, just type any comments or questions that you may have on the subject just into your comment section, either on Facebook or on YouTube. And since we have, obviously an in-depth expert into the field, take advantage. And don't be modest, but please take advantage of it. We do have a couple of things that have popped up already, so let's get going. This came up when you were talking about the oil spills just a couple of minutes ago, and Karen wanted to point out not just oil spills to worry about, but it's accompanying cargo and literally garbage on the barges, which is something, that you brought up a bit already.
Yeah, the polar bear picture, when you see all the polar bears standing around those crates, a lot of that is garbage that has kind of washed up, and the Arctic kind of becomes a dumping ground for a lot of the currents and things that, trash that's coming up from the cruises, but also from the freighters and that kind of thing.
We had a question from Titus who asks, what are the positive and negative trade-offs to increase tourism in the Arctic?
Thank you for your question. That's a good one. I think I will confess, despite living in Wisconsin for almost a decade and being a Michigan native, I'm cold below 30 degrees. So the idea of being in the Arctic does not appeal to me as kind of a tourism effort. But I think, I mentioned my colleague, Bonnie Hamilton, she does a lot of field work in the Arctic. And I think there's been, again, from a science perspective, but I think it's really incredible to see. For me, it would be the ecosystem. I think it would be seeing polar bears in the wild, seeing the caribou migrate, seeing the walruses. And I'm good with following that from kind of National Geographic's Instagram, sitting by a nice warm fire. But I can see how those kind of more the ecotourism could be appealing, similar to when you go on some of the African safaris, being able to see the animals there. But also, I think I wouldn't necessarily call it tourism, but I think some of the scientific research opportunities that for my science friends, that is essential. It's fun for them. Like, they're going to love going up there and thriving on that. But on the trade-off there, I think you do have significant animal disruption, conflict with some of the animals that are up there because they haven't had a lot of human interaction in some cases. And so I think logistically, it would also be tough in terms of where are people going to stay. If they're going to be at these research stations, do you build an Arctic hotel? I think everything that comes along with tourism and the waste and sort of the human impact, for me, would be a concern coming from an environmental standpoint. But again, I would love to see the polar bears in the wild, but I would also, I think, have a little bit of guilt about disrupting some of that community. And if you read anything about some of the wildlife photographers, how important, I think in some cases, how heart-wrenching it is, because they can't interfere. If they're watching a polar bear struggle or pass away, they can't interfere to help. And so I would struggle with, I think, some of that aspects, but it would also be really cool to see, the orcas and to see, I think, some of those species in the wild.
Karen West had a follow-up question to her comment earlier. Could you speak about the methane gas trapped under the ice?
Very little bit. That is not an area I know a ton about. I know as the permafrost is melting, we're starting to see a lot more methane gas that is being trapped under the ice. There's also, I think it was National Geographic or the Smithsonian, one of the two had basically poisonous gases and other toxic things that are being emitted. So some of the Siberian community is getting very sick. Anthrax being released in some cases. There's bodies that were essentially frozen and buried. It gets a little ghoulish, which is why I didn't go far down that route. But basically, as the permafrost is eroding, things that had been buried under it are coming out. And so I've looked more at the greenhouse gas aspect with methane, but there's also, from sort of your biological hazard kinds of studies, a lot of concern about what diseases could be re-released as you have this permafrost melting and things that had been buried quite deep coming up to the surface again. So like I said, I'm a little too squeamish for too far down that road, but the Smithsonian and National Geographic both have quite a bit there.
Currently, that was a final question that we have, but I know we have people that are following along, so now would be the time to type something into the comment section of either your Facebook page or on our YouTube channel. Any questions that anyone has, I'm sure Professor Wheat would be happy to answer them on this topic. While we have a break in people asking questions, I just wanted to remind everyone that next week, changing things up completely, but altogether fascinating subject as well. We're going to be talking about the Korean Peninsula next week with Professor David Fields from UW-Madison. So that is the topic for next week, and we have another question. that came in while I was addressing what we will be doing next week. Do you have any idea how much greenhouse gases emissions could be emitted from melting ice and snow? Also, any idea how much CO2 could hypothetically be released with these sinks shrinking?
I don't have a good sense on that, and I'm not sure kind of where the research is on that one, because I know it's been observed, not to the point we know it's happening, but I don't know in terms of a scale on that. And part of that gets into, I think, some measurement challenges of sort of figuring out where you're going to measure that. And this is a really big space we're trying to look at. So yeah, I mean, that gets into a little bit more kind of the atmospheric science that is a bit out of my wheelhouse, but I think a really good question and something to be thinking about as we get more mindful about greenhouse gases, because this is not an area they're going to bear the brunt of a lot of the effects. And it's not an area that we might be able to protect as much. So we will need to be reducing emissions elsewhere because we might not be able to kind of stop the emissions from this melting ice and snow in the way that we need to here. So yeah, I apologize. I don't have kind of specific numbers on that one, but we're observing it. We are projecting it's going to get worse as the sinks are shrinking, and that could potentially put more pressure on other areas to continue reducing their emissions.
I have a question, actually, and we do have other questions coming up to mind when you were talking. When you had said that the Arctic Ocean in the future may be free of ice flows completely during portions of the year, I think you had mentioned that. Like, how much of the year? I don't know on that. And I'm not sure if they have kind of exact months or days projected. I was shocked when I was reading that. I think it was one of the monitoring stations for the reports that I looked at. But just the idea that it could be free for you in any period of time was mind-boggling. But the rates have just been so much faster than they were projecting. And that Chasing Ice documentary that I mentioned, I will say that has one of the most just stunning photography you've ever seen. And the same researchers have been going to these places for years and years. And you literally can watch the glacier melt in their time-lapse photography. And that's really where we started getting data about how this is faster than we had expected. And so, I don't know if they have, I'm sure someone has a sense of kind of how long that could be ice free, but just the idea that even for a few weeks or days was mind boggling to me. Yeah. All right. Definitely. I'll get back to other people's questions. I don't mean to monopolize it all, but Michael Wilner had a question. Has the economic benefit of shipping through the Arctic been estimated?
I'm sure it has. And I think they've done some projections based on when the routes might open up, whether or not an icebreaker is going to be needed, because the icebreaker escort is certainly going to add shipping time or shipping cost in addition to the time that it takes to literally break the ice as you're going forward. I have not looked at specific estimates of, so I can't give you a dollar amount on that, but if we see these routes continue to open, and if they're open for longer periods of time, you then have the X factor of how are we regulating this space? Is it a free-for-all where everybody can ship however they want? Do we have quotas? If we use kind of a similar Canadian-US model, they did try and minimize some of the fuel. They did try and minimize some of the numbers of freighters. But I don't know if they've had those conversations if the Arctic is going to open, because it's still a few decades off. So it's not like it's happening tomorrow on that. But it's a really good question. There definitely would be an economic benefit to that. But the environmentalist part of me is more concerned about kind of the environmental harm than kind of cheaper shipping with that. But that Freighton documentary that I mentioned gets into some of those cost estimates too.
Ann Schutte was wondering, how are the issues of the Arctic indigenous people given serious consideration at the Arctic Council summits?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I encourage you to check out the Arctic Council website. I did not list the tribes, list indigenous groups here, largely because big pronunciation challenge on that. But what's really cool is that they, by my understanding and reading with the council, they are valued as equal partners. They have the same consultation rights that a country would. And depending on the issue, some tribes may be more, or some indigenous groups, I should say, some groups may be more involved with an issue than others. So for example, I know the Gwich'in General Alaska are heavily dependent on the migratory caribou. So when there was discussion in the US about opening the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, that was a huge issue for the Gwich'in that they're going to bring up at the council, because the pipeline and any sort of drilling could directly affect the caribou, which not only affect their food source, but cultural and spiritual practices of the Gwich'in as well. And so I know they're involved in those conversations, involved in the working groups, and I'm not sure on kind of the procedures of if they have to agree or can they disagree with the Arctic Council agreements. But I really, again, there's 6 other representatives, so 6 organizations that are indigenous groups that are represented. And it really, again, by all accounts, it feels like they're treated as full and meaningful participants in those decisions.
Nick had another question. Could there be an ecological risk of some non-native species hitchhiking with tourist ship transportation or air transportation?
That's a really good question. My inclination is to say yes. The question that I would have with that is with the temperature, though, because if you have such a drastic temperature difference with the Arctic waters, that I don't know if any sort of invasive species or hitchhiker would be able to survive in that area. But at the same time, with invasive species, as we know from the Midwest, they're not predictable, and they can take over and respond in ways that we might never have anticipated. The International Maritime Organization does have some regulations on ballast water and kind of treating that, but that brings up a good question of would they apply those same regulations to the Arctic? Would they maybe want to consider new ones to protect or to minimize some of these invasives or non-natives, traveling along? That'd be a big issue to think about. I hopefully we don't have any that I do that, but I definitely do see a potential risk on that.
Very interesting and direct question from Joan Gramling here. If the U.S. doesn't drill in the Arctic, will other countries go after those reserves?
Yeah, Russia will in a heartbeat. Russia already is trying to, because so much of their reserve and just their energy needs and potential for economic growth or other additions that Putin would like to make in Siberia. I think Russia would be the most likely suspect because they're already there. They're much closer with the capabilities. But with China's Polar Silk Road, that is the other big, big one to watch. That China is very interested in getting a foothold in this area and developing additional maritime and economic and mining resources. So those would be the two that I think would go after the reserves. But it really would depend on where in the Arctic you're talking about as well, because countries have that exclusive economic zone. And that gives them, again, that 200 nautical mile buffer. It'd have to be beyond that. And right now, even offshore drilling in the US is really difficult. And you want to add in Arctic conditions into drilling, and it's going to be incredibly challenging extractive process. So no one's really there yet, but Russia and China, I think, are working towards it quickly.
Mark Maurer had a comment and a question. From a capitalist perspective, there seems to be much more incentive to clear the Arctic ice than to preserve it, unless the capitalists lack ownership of the Arctic and other countries stand to gain more. Can you speak to any differences or likenesses between the two U.S. political party stances on the U.S. involvement in the Arctic?
Well, I'd say we don't, excuse me, we don't know the current administration's stance on this. I was looking up for statements from President Biden, and that I have not come across any yet. So I'll compare, sort of Trump to Obama. Obama emphasized more of the diplomatic, collaborative approach, recognizing climate change, working with the indigenous communities, and I think more of an ecosystem management approach. The Trump administration took a very different approach, emphasizing military and security and confronting Russia and China. And that's not to say that Obama didn't also think about Russia and China, but the tones of the two administrations were vastly different. One was much more diplomacy-based, and one was much more, I would argue, a little more confrontation or forceful diplomacy of saying, we're going to try and buy part of your country. We want to put some military there. We're going to give you some aid to incentivize that. And so I think the strategies of the last two presidents were very different. And, so we don't know where the current administration is going to go on that. If I had to hazard a guess, I would say you see a bit more of the environmental focus of the Obama administration, but also considerations of the military and national security. Because of some of these countries and the positioning of bases and early warning systems, and I think a growing skepticism of Russia and China, it's not going to be as cooperative with Russia under the current administration as it was with President Trump. And so I think you're going to see more diplomatic pressure exerted on Russia to, maybe not beef up some of the military bases, or to not expand the nuclear fleet, or things along those lines. So I think we're going to see a shift in how the U.S. works with with China and Russia going forward. But in terms of general Arctic involvement, I would guess we see kind of more of the environmental focus going forward, just because of the climate change and having a climate czar and the administrative positions that President Biden's created. But yeah, they've had, I think also, again, the other important aspect here too is President Trump wanting to reopen drilling in Alaska, signifying more of an extractive focus on the sensitive ecosystems. And I don't get that sense kind of from the Biden administration that there'll be that similar extractive, let's drill and take out the resources. I think you're going to see more of a protective effort.
David Gratz had a follow-up question. Essentially, it's that question in many ways. What do you think should be the first U.S. priority here in the Arctic at this time?
That's a really good question. It's tough because my master's was the environmental policy side of my brain, and then my doctorate sort of the political science brain. And I really would like to see, I think, more of a climate change focus, because I think climate and sustainability. I think if you take a sustainability approach, that gets you thinking about the biodiversity effects. It doesn't say you can't have any shipping routes. It's thinking about ways to minimize harm, kind of like what we saw with Canada and the US. So I really would think of, and I would lean more towards that sustainability of, okay, if we're going to develop, how can we protect the fisheries? How can we manage it equitably? How can we manage it safely? How can we protect the affected communities? And I think sustainability is a nice umbrella to cover. It's kind of a cheat factor probably, but I think it's a nice umbrella to balance, for me, really important environmental concerns, but also recognizing that you have to think of political and economic concerns as well. You can't say no drilling, protect all the polar bears. But I also don't think you send all the icebreakers in and ship everything and ruin the whole ecosystem as well. I think there needs to be a more common space where I would like to see leaning towards the environmental protection, but as these routes change, we are going to see more economic pressure. So I'm hoping we go with kind of more what we saw with that Arctic strategy, or with that ecosystem-based management that the EU advocates, because I think that gets at all of those pieces. But if I had to give after the long answer, a short answer, I'd like to see a new Arctic strategy that focused on sustainability, thinking of the environmental protections, and also ways to minimize harm with any economic development that might take place in the future.
These have all been really great questions so far. We have a little bit of time left, so don't be shy. If you have any more questions, and now is the time to ask. Thank you to everyone who's been following along tonight. Honestly, your participation has been fantastic tonight, and it was a fantastic lecture. So once again, a great evening of great decisions in brief. And I will give this a couple more moments for questions or comments. Perhaps that is all everyone has to say.
One thing I would add, actually, this was a fascinating area to look into. That I knew my background was more again in the environmental aspects with this region, but I really encourage you to check out check out the documentaries, read some of the monitoring reports that are out there. This is such a rich ecosystem, both with the species and just beautiful. A number of the pictures that were included, as I mentioned, were from Bonnie Hamilton, and this is what she sees when she goes on these research trips. And so I just encourage you, look into this. If you want to focus more on the geopolitics or on the species or the shipping, there's so much to really, I think, get into and learn about. And so just encourage you to check it out.
And what are the names of the documentaries you brought up again, just in case anyone didn't get them?
Sure. Chasing Ice and Freightened, which, again, play on the shipping freight. Both are really, really good, and I think get at a lot of issues that we discussed tonight.
All right, great. Well, I think we're just going to wrap it up there. Once again, thank you to everyone who watched the lecture and had questions and comments this evening. Thank you again to Professor Wheat for a fantastic lecture. Join us again next week for the Korean Peninsula, a completely different but equally fascinating topic. Also, if anyone wanted to have a copy sent to them of Professor Wheat's PowerPoint from this evening, just contact me at tgidzinski@manitowoc.org, and I will send it to you right away. And also, in addition to a thank you from Mark Maurer, there was a question that just came in, and it is: are there any citizens and scientists focused brigades that citizens can join? Good question.
That's a really good question. I know it's the last young woman that I featured on the last slide was part of the Greenpeace expedition. I am sure there are a number of different brigades that they can join. Feel free to email, and I'm happy to look into some of those. I don't have specific names right now because the ones that I'm more familiar with are connected to either the monitoring programs or through doctoral programs. But I am happy to reach out to friends that kind of work in this area and get that information for you.
And if you do find anything out, feel free to email them to me as well, and I will post them on Facebook so that people can, get in, find them. But reach out to Professor Wheat as well. I'm not trying to. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming this evening. Have a great night, and we'll see you next week. And thank you very much to everyone. Have a great night.